let's talk about the DOM. This is movie number 3 of 3 for this week, and we just need to dive a little bit deeper. If you remember, the DOM is kind of like a tree, but it's upside down. It's not green, but otherwise just exactly like a tree, maybe a bush. But basically you have parented elements that have children elements, and it resembles a kind of a hierarchy. Each of these pieces are called nodes. So each element is an element node. Now if you want to take control of your page, you're first going to have to master this whole DOM thing. So in this example, you have HTML as the parent of all the other elements. Head and body are siblings, and they each have kids. And the paragraph has 3 children, or 3 child elements, or 3 child nodes. So each element on an HTML page links to its parent in the DOM. Now, realistically, there's this master global thing called document at the very, very top of the hierarchy, and we will start there a lot of times when we work with the DOM. But what happens is, not only are there nodes or pieces or parts for all the different HTML elements, and HTML elements are like anchor and paragraph and div, but not only are nodes for elements, but there are nodes for text. So here's the complete DOM tree, including text nodes. There's one more small complication we need to think about, is not only for each anchor tag is there a text node, but there are also attribute nodes. So we have element nodes, we have text nodes, and we have attribute nodes in the DOM. Things can get pretty complicated pretty fast with all these things flying around, but it becomes necessary to kind of understand how all this works. Because in many ways, manipulating an element via the DOM is a lot like applying element styles in CSS. You have this general pattern going on. You specify or select or query the element or group of elements that you want to affect, and then you specify the effect you want to have on them. So let's find an element by ID. So if you look at a paragraph in HTML that has a unique ID on it, in CSS you would say pound unique ID. Talk right to it, tell it to be a color blue. In JavaScript, you'd create a variable, call it anything you want to, in this instance target, and then you'd say document, that master, that root element, document.getElement by ID, and then in parentheses and in quotes, the ID of that element. Not hard, just verbose, and remember JavaScript is case sensitive. So make sure when you say get element by ID, you capitalize it properly. Only the E and the B and the I are capitalized. And it's not plural because there's only going to be one ID per page. Each ID is supposed to be unique. If you find an element by ID, you can say in this code, you've got an anchor tag with an ID of Behringer. To address it with JavaScript, you create a variable, target, equals document.getElement by ID, and then parentheses quotes Behringer, and you could say alert target.nodename to, because node name is a property of target, and it would pop up an alert dialog box that says A, because that's the node name. The node is the element node in this case. Now if you want to find an element by ID, you can think of it like a sniper, where you can pick out just one element at a time. It's very highly targeted. It returns a single item. Remember, IDs are unique. If an item doesn't exist, it will return the value null. We'll talk about null a little bit, as opposed to undefined. But if an item doesn't exist, it will return the value null. And it's only available from the document node. So don't try and run this from any other nodes than the document node. Null is a special value that usually indicates some kind of error, and I'll explain that a little bit better in a few more slides. But essentially, null indicates the absence of an object and one might normally be expected. Again, let's look at document.getElementById Behringer. You might want to test and make sure it was found. So if target is not equal to null, do some code. Otherwise, you're going to generate an error, your JavaScript is going to stop, and you're not going to be a happy camper. Now, here we are talking about null versus undefined. A property, when it has no definition, is undefined. Undefined is not an object. So if you put it that way, it sounds pretty obvious. But what's interesting is null is an object. Its type is null. So it's a value you can assign to a variable when you want to indicate that the variable has no particular value. And that's less obvious, because null just means completely, there's nothing. Unassigned variables and object properties do not begin with a default value of null. Instead, they begin with a special value called undefined. You may want to have to think about this, read up about it. There's 3 pretty good URLs down at the bottom of the slide you can look at that explain this. But just remember, undefined is associated with a property. Null is an object. So let's find elements by tag name. Sometimes you just want to find a bunch of list items and do something to them, or all the pieces of a form, all the text areas or text elements of a form. And what you want to do is find elements by the tag name. So let's look at the limitations and the benefits of this, because it returns a group of elements. It returns a node list. It's kind of like an array. A node list is a JavaScript object that contains a list of node objects in the order they appear. Very similar to an array. Now, it returns a node list even if no elements match the supplied tag name. The length of the list node, or the node list, will be 0. So you're not going to come back with a null value. You're going to come back with a 0 as far as the length. And it can be executed as a method of any element node, but most commonly it's called on the document node. So if you had 2 unordered lists or 4 unordered lists in a document and you just wanted the second one, you can target just the second one by starting with the ID of the second unordered list. So if you want to find them, here's an example. A variable list items equals document.getElements by tag name. Notice the S in elements, because it by definition is a node list. There can be as many as appear in the document. When you find an element by ID, there can only be one, but tag name, there can be any number of them. And if we wanted to target the second item, we could take that variable list items, and it's returning an array, and look at the second one. And remember, we start counting at 0, so the second one is number 1. So variable list items equal document.getElements by tag name, and in this instance, we're looking at all the list items. And then we're going to go and say, let's look at just the list items in the second one. Can be a little bit confusing. Just think about it. Now, variable list items equal document.getElements by tag name list items. Again, we're looking for list items. If we wanted to step through them all and do something to them, and this can come in very handy, it's very commonly done, where you want to go through and step through a bunch of elements and do something to them. So we would use a for loop starting with 0 and using the length of list items, because it returns an array, a list of nodes, and we're going to increment it by 1 in the parameter for the for loop. And right now we're just doing something mundane, like listing all the items by their node name. So you can loop through using the length of the list items, or length of the node list that is returned. and a for loop. Very, very powerful thing. So let's restrict our name tag selection by looking at two unordered lists in this document. Notice we've got our normal HTML, we've got our body tag, and see, there's the body tag, and we've got one unordered list, and we have another unordered list. We're going to work on this, and you might want to get the list items for that second list only, not the first one. And if you were to call document.getElements by tag name li for list item, you'd end up with a collection that contained all 5 list items in the document, which is obviously not what you want. But if you get a reference to the second list and use that reference to call the method, it's possible to get the list items from that list alone. So let's look at this. So we have a variable name list, document.getElements by tag name, unordered list. Whoa. So we've got 2 of those. And if we create a variable called second list, and it takes the second UL out of that first list. So we got a list of unordered lists. We're going to pick the second one, throw it into a variable, and then we're going to refer to all the list items in the second list. Just look at that a little bit and think about it. But the result is the second list items now contain just the 2 list items from the second list. Let's look at the code, okay? Here's the code we're running, and we're saying var lists equal getElements by tag name unordered lists. We got both unordered lists. And we're taking the second one and assigning it to another variable. Awesome, so we have a target of the second unordered list. And now we're taking all the elements, all the list items, I should say, all the list item elements in that second unordered list and throwing them in another variable. So we're kind of drilling down step by step till we get exactly the elements we want to work with. Now we've used 2 getElements by tag name calls to get the elements we wanted, but there is an alternative. If each unordered list had an ID on them, you could just call the second ID and getElements by tag name and do it that way. Probably a little bit more straightforward, and if you're authoring the code, it's what I would recommend. But combining multiple DOM method calls is something you should get a feel for really quickly, because we're going to be doing it an awful lot. And the best approach often depends upon the structure of the HTML you're working with. One option that's rather new, just to be honest, is getElements by class name. And unlike IDs, which there's only one per document, getElement by class name is plural. And you can also put in more than one class to look for. The elements that are returned are a node list of found elements in the order that they appear in the tree. Names in the string representing the list of class names to match. You just separate them by some white space. And getElements by class name can be called on any element, not only on the document. The element on which it's called will be used as the root of the search. It's just kind of like what we were doing with getElements by tag name. So what does that look like? GetElements by class name, and the top one is on a single class, and the second one there are 2 classes we're looking for: test, space, and test2. It's very similar to the way you define classes in HTML, just separate them with some white space. The first expression returns a node list with all the elements that have a class value that contains test. But the second one returns a node list with all the elements that have a class value that contain both test and test2 in any order. Small problem. You can see this coming a mile away. So wait for it. Yeah, it's IE. IE less than 9, in other words, Windows 7. All you Vista people and certainly XP folks who are using 8 and below, this doesn't work so well. So what do? One really good solution is jQuery.